Roman Bystrianyk, thank you for joining me again in the trenches.
Thank you for having me. I really appreciate it. I mean, it's nice to have this platform. I really do appreciate it. Thank you.
Your work has dramatically influenced me for all the right reasons.
That's fabulous. I like to present, like I will today, present information that you probably never saw before, that's based on vital statistics data, National Health Services data, and lots of history books and all sorts of data. So here's the information, and it's up to you to decide what you want to do with it.
Okay, well, I'm ready when you are. I know that there's a bunch of stuff to get through, so take it away, Roman.
This is all about giving you information. It's empowering you to make your own decisions. I'm not telling anybody what to do. I'm not the government telling you what to do. I'm not your doctor telling you what to do. I like for people to look at information, think about it, do their own research, and then see what happens. You decide what you want to do. So I'd like to thank you for having this platform, I'm really blessed. Thank you. I want to thank lots of people that helped me over the last 25 years. It's been a long journey. Thank all the people who compiled all this data. I mean, there's thousands, if not millions of people that did that over the many decades. There's critical key people that I read books from the 17, 18, and early 1900s, from Crichton to Cruikshank, and all these wonderful, smart people, smart doctors that wrote books. So thank you to them, because without them, I wouldn't know a lot of stuff. And thank you for everybody who's read Dissolving Illusions, who took the data, took the information, and spread it around. I really appreciate all the readers. Thank you so much. I thought I'd go over a couple of quotes that I think are inspirational. It is proof of a base and low mind for one to wish to think with the masses or majority merely because the majority is the majority. Truth does not change because it is or is not believed by the majority of the people. And that was said 500 years ago by Giordano Bruno. This is one of my favorite quotes: the fatal tendency of mankind to leave off thinking about a thing when it is no longer doubtful is the cause of half their errors. John Stuart Mill. Dr. Walter Hadwin, he was not very big on vaccines. Majorities are never proof of the truth. So when you're looking at this new stuff that maybe you've never seen before, it's always good to go to intellectual and emotional neutral. See what I have to say, and you can accept or reject it. It's all up to you. But I want to provide you with information that's well referenced. So I'm going to tell you where I got the data from. It's also, all the quotes are referenced, so you can look up anything you want. Pictures are referenced. And so you can look up anything that I present and verify it for yourself and do more research and come to your own conclusions. So it all begins with data. This is where I started my journey, and I think this is the most important part. And it's important. If you have an idea, that's something you have, but an ideology is something that has you. So if you have this strong belief because somebody told you it, that's an ideology. And here's a classic quote from George Orwell: "Who controls the past controls the future. Who controls the present controls the past." And we can change the word past to data. So whoever controls the data controls the future. Who controls the present controls the data. Our public officials and the government, the medical organizations control the data, and they present the data they want to show you. They don't show you all the data. So here's the first chart in the lower right-hand corner. It's a chart of measles deaths from 1900 to 1985, I think. And then this is a book called The U.S. Vital Statistics, this one was published in the 1960s. And they had the same chart on page 85 there. So the chart I created 50 years later was the same chart they had in the 1960s. So I had no idea that that chart existed until a few years ago. But you can see the data matches identically, right? You can also go to dissolvingillusions.com, and every chart that I created has all the references. So you can look up any of that stuff, or you can go to the US Vital Statistics, page 85. Here's the link. You can download that PDF and go to page 85. You'll see here's the measles, and there's a whole bunch of other charts they have there too. That way you're verifying that the data I'm presenting is very accurate. The US started gathering statistics in the year 1900. And so here we have from 1900 to 1970 measles deaths. So the left-hand side shows you deaths per 100,000. You normalize to deaths per 100,000 so that if populations change, you can make an accurate determination of what your basic death rate was. And then the bottom is the year. So from 1900 to 1970. The measles vaccine began in 1963. That was the first measles vaccine. And by that point, we had a 98.6% decrease in mortality. England began gathering statistics in 1838, much earlier. They were way ahead of the game. And here you can see measles deaths were very high during the 1800s, from let's say 40 to 60, 40 to 50 deaths per 100,000. And then by the mid 1900s, it had dropped to almost zero. The measles vaccine in England began in 1968. So you already had 100%, almost 100% decrease in mortality rate. That's the death rate in measles by the time they started vaccinating in 1968. Sometimes people would write about it in medical journals, not very often. If you go looking for it, you'll almost never see the thing I just talked about. Here, Clive E. West talked about it in 2000 in Nutrition Reviews, and he noted that before there was a vaccine, measles mortality had fallen to 0.03%, which is 1/200th of the 1908 Glasgow mortality rate of 5.8%. That's a 99.5% decrease, which is what we just saw in that chart. Almost 100%.
But the medical industry never mentions this.
No. And this is why that first chart I did was such a shock to me. When I first put together that first chart, I couldn't believe it was actually right, even though I had the data from the US Vital Statistics and I put it in my spreadsheet and I checked the data. This was back when you had to photocopy things. And so I photocopied them and I entered the data into a spreadsheet and I checked it and double checked it and triple checked it. There's nothing wrong with the data. There's nothing wrong with the data, and the chart is spot on. As you saw earlier, it matches the US Vital Statistics charts from 1960. But it's not mentioned. No one ever tells you this. If you go to your doctor and say, "Oh, we're going to give you a vaccine," but they don't tell you this. So you're not getting all the information to make an informed decision. Another disease, whooping cough, also called pertussis. And here we can see that in the early 1900s, we had a higher death rate, and we can see it goes down, down, down until you got into the 1960s, where it's near zero. The pertussis vaccine began use in the late 1940s. It's hard to pin down an exact date, but somewhere in the late 40s. And by that point, you had an over 90% decrease in deaths. And what's interesting, if you look at a trend line, which is the rate where you expect the deaths to go, from 1920 until 1985, you can see it's hard to tell where the vaccine came in, because you would expect when the vaccine came in, there would be a big drop in deaths, but that's not what happened. So here's where the vaccine came in. There's no real interruption in the trend line. It basically continues on the same way it was before. So the vaccine didn't really have any impact on the trend of death.
So the vaccine didn't improve the situation, but it didn't worsen it either.
That's correct. So there's no obvious improvement in mortality rate, right? There's nothing you could say, wow, there's a big drop, right? England again started in 1838. Deaths were from 40 to 60 per 100,000. You can see by the 1960s, the death rate was basically zero. In the UK, they started in 1957, national use of the vaccine. And by that point, you had almost 100% decline in mortality rate. The vaccine came in way after most of the work had been done. This chart's a little different. It's not deaths per 100,000. It's total deaths on the left. And again, the years on the bottom, 1901 to 2008. The gray line is the whooping cough deaths. The dotted blue line is vaccination coverage. So again, 1957 is when they began vaccinating at the national level. Here you can see there's a big drop in vaccination rates. So it went from 80% down to 30%. And the reason for that, there was a big DTP scare that it was causing neurological damage in the UK and actually in the United States as well. And so vaccination rates dropped off. The medical system panicked, and they eventually got vaccination rates back up to where they wanted them, over 90%. But as you can see, there's really no noticeable increase in deaths. So because you're already at zero, you're almost at zero. So when vaccination rates dropped, there was no real increase in deaths. We have a case study in Sweden. They determined in 1978 that 84% of children who had whooping cough had received 3 doses of vaccine. So they deemed that vaccine as ineffective. And because of concerns over safety, they discontinued vaccination in 1979. So they actually stopped vaccinating in Sweden. And here's a chart showing deaths on the left, which were high in the 1800s. And they began vaccinating in 1953. So there's really no impact on mortality. During the 17 years of no vaccination program in Sweden, there's no big spike up in deaths. Here's a magnified view of the 17 years of no vaccination program. So for 17 years, you can see there's maybe one death one year, one death the next year, one death the next year. And there's years with no deaths. And then after they restarted the vaccination program, there's maybe 2 deaths or a little bit more. So it's a little worse, but it's almost, not any different. So from 1981 to 1993, based on Sweden's population, the odds of dying from whooping cough with no vaccination program was 1 in 13 million. So not a real severe thing to worry about. Other diseases. Scarlet fever was a bigger killer, about twice as bad as whooping cough or measles. And you can see in the 1800s, it went from like 80 to 140 deaths per 100,000, which is quite high. You'll see a pattern here. Starting in the 1875 or so, deaths began to decline until by the 1950s, 1940s, 50s, and 60s, you have almost no deaths. As a matter of fact, with scarlet fever, there was no vaccine. You have a 100% decline in deaths. So no one's dying of scarlet fever anymore, right? Even though it was called the fell destroyer during the 1800s, it was a big killer. Now it's nothing, and there's no vaccine program. Another one is typhoid fever. You can see here in the vital statistics in 1944, they talked about there was a 98.7% decrease. Really, in reality, no one dies of typhoid fever anymore. 100% decrease without any vaccine. A disease you probably never really heard of, the white plague. They used to call it the white plague or consumption, and we now know as tuberculosis. A far bigger killer than scarlet fever or any of those one we just mentioned. We're talking about 300 to 350 deaths per 100,000. So it's about 5 to 7 times higher than whooping cough or measles. And we can see it's, again, dropping off starting around 1975, down, 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 down. And 1947, they came out with an antibiotic, streptomycin, and the BCG vaccine for tuberculosis in 1954. And you can see that happened way later. And according to Thomas McEwen, in his book in 1979, The Role of Medicine, Dream, Mirage, or Nemesis, we're down about 97% before the introduction of antibiotics or vaccination. Because oftentimes I hear about, oh, well, it was the vaccine may have came later, but it was antibiotics that took care of the problem. We can see here that's simply not the case.
What's interesting about TB is that it's still a problem here in South Africa, and it seems to be most severe in the poverty-stricken areas.
Right. You'll find as we go through this discussion, that's some of the keys there is poverty more than anything else. If we look at a magnified view, I forgot to mention this. So you'll notice the little bumps at the bottom left. That's the deaths from smallpox. The white plague was 48 to 50, basically 50 times bigger than smallpox, but you never really hear about the white plague or consumption or tuberculosis. It's a big deal. That's because it went away without any kind of vaccine, really. Here's a magnified view of that same kind of thing, trend line. So from 1915 to 1917, you can see that little thin line going from left to right. And you can see the trend line wasn't really interrupted by any event. It basically just continued to chug along. And this is when they introduced the antibiotic and the vaccine. So no real interruption. It basically just would have gone down anyway. Maybe it had some tiny effect, but not much of anything, especially since you're already down by 97%. And again, sometimes people mention penicillin. Well, penicillin did everything, and then they always mention the vaccines, but here's where they came in much later. So those were not the big interventions that people think they were. Another one, flu pneumonia, they always lump those together. So you can see on the left, this is in the United States, pretty big killer. There's a big spike up in 1918. That's a big flu pandemic kind of thing. But you can see things drop, and it basically stabilizes around the 1970s. And so by the time they started vaccinating for the flu in the late 70s, we're down by 90%. Now, if we do another magnified view, the brownish line is the deaths. And we can see around late 1970s, it starts going back up and then goes back down. The vaccination rates, this is for 65-year and older, because those are the people that actually get really sick and maybe die from the flu or pneumonia. Your average person, unless they're elderly or very young, doesn't die from the flu, generally. Anyway, so they got the vaccination rates up, but you can see the brown line is not affected. The death rate basically goes up and then goes back to where it was in the 70s. There's no decrease in death rate. So despite decades of vaccination, there's no real effect on the death rate. And that's over 40 years.
But do you know what happened in that little spike area?
When it's going up?
Mm.
Well, it didn't go down, so that's not good. So, it went up. Who knows why? I mean, it's going from like 20s to 30s per 100,000. So it did go up. So the data is showing, this is what's happening with the flu, which makes you think, well, what good is the flu vaccine? So a recent paper in Cell Host Microbe, Fauci is actually the third author on that paper, where they say more than 60 years of experience with influenza vaccines, very little improvement in vaccine prevention and infection has been noted. As pointed out decades ago and still true today, the rates of effectiveness of our best approved influenza vaccines would be inadequate for licensure for most other vaccine preventable diseases. Taking all of these factors into account, it is not surprising that none of the predominantly mucosal respiratory viruses have ever been effectively controlled by vaccines. Durably protective vaccines against non-systemic mucosal respiratory viruses with high mortality rates have thus far eluded vaccine development efforts. So what are they saying here? They're admitting in their own journals that after 60 years, they haven't really done anything. They have not controlled anything with their vaccines. It's eluded their vaccine development efforts. But that doesn't keep them from recommending the same vaccines and new modified vaccines over and over and over again. So you would think after 60 years of not being able to do anything, they would just say, well, this didn't work out. Let's do something else. But that's not what happens. This admission in this medical journal reinforces what the data is saying, that nothing's working. It's not working. But there's confirmation bias in medicine. What are they saying in medical journals? And I always wondered that when I was doing this research, what are they saying in there? So here's a very important paper released in 1988 in the journal Pediatrics, Pertussis and Pertussis Immunization. And this is the first paragraph in that paper where they talk about how pertussis, whooping cough, has been successfully controlled by routine mass immunization. And they say, well, before the vaccine, it was 5,000 to 10,000 deaths. And then after, in the last 10 years, according to this paper from 1978 to 1988, it's about 5 to 10 deaths. So they give full credit to the vaccine. What's interesting is they're not giving you the whole story in this paragraph. So here's where they say there's 5 to 10,000 deaths per year, which is true. But this is where the 5 to 10 deaths are off onto the right. But this is where the vaccine was introduced. So does it make sense to anybody? It doesn't make sense to me that it's because of the vaccine that caused that big drop in the beginning. And again, if we look at the trend line, here's where the vaccine was introduced. Here's what they talk about in the paper, 5 to 10,000 deaths. And here's where they were talking about there are 5 to 10 deaths. The trend line shows it would have gone down anyway. So that's a completely disingenuous statement that they make in the first paragraph of their paper.
Do you think they knew that?
So when in that paper, they reference the data. So they reference Colonial Times data. I don't remember the exact name of the paper. So I don't know if they charted it or they just looked at the table and said, oh, well, a lot of people used to die and now they don't. I don't know, if they just made a mistake or if they knew. There's no way to know. They also didn't look at other data like England. They could have looked at that data if they so chose, and they would have known that, before there was a vaccine, it had dropped by nearly 100%. And they also didn't look at this data. Here's a drop in vaccination rate. There's no increase in deaths. So how important is the vaccine? they didn't mention any of that data either. So I would basically give this paper an F- because this paragraph read by so many pediatricians and doctors is completely misleading. It's completely false. It's not true. This is a completely misleading paper and unfortunate.
Based on the F-, I think it deserves this.
So medicine is completely pro-vaccine biased, even when the data doesn't really support what they're saying. Here's another paper in Journal of American Medical Association, 2007. They're talking about vaccine preventable diseases. The emphasis is always on the vaccine and nothing else, right? And then in there, they have a table and they say here, in this date range, 1953 to 1962, there were 440 deaths on average. And then after, it's zero. So they give 100% credit to the vaccine. But again, if we look at the chart, we see this is where they're talking about their date range. And here's where the vaccine is introduced, but we already had a 98% decrease. So looking at this whole chart doesn't make sense to anybody. It doesn't make sense to me that it's the vaccine that took care of the problem. But this is what the paper says. And so if anybody reading that would go, well, of course you would be crazy not to vaccinate. It's 100% effective. And again, they don't look at other data like England and Wales, which already had a 100% decrease in mortality by the time they started vaccinating. If they had looked at that, they would have concluded, well, maybe we don't need to vaccinate. At least that's what I would think they would have thought. And again, I think it's another F- paper because they're not telling you the whole story. Check it add sound. I need that sound effect for my presentation. I don't think there's any way else to look at it. Here's all the data. It shows clearly what occurred, and then things are skewed and presented in a different way. So you can see this kind of behavior in all these papers. And these are peer-reviewed papers. So whoever's looking at these papers is not really looking in deeply, or if they look, they go, well, we got to let it slide. I don't know what they're thinking. So what does this data tell us? The vast majority, nearly 100% of improvement in deaths from all infectious diseases, measles, whooping cough, scarlet fever, typhoid, paratyphoid, tuberculosis, flu, pneumonia happened before the use of antibiotics or vaccines. And this is from my co-author, great quote, with enough indoctrination, repetition, mythology becomes a collective reality, but doesn't make it true, which is what I believe has happened. This idea has been indoctrinated for decade after decade after decade, and everybody just goes along with the program. Even if they make honest mistakes, I think part of the reason is because they have this idea ahead of time that vaccines are great, therefore that skews their thinking because they've been indoctrinated into a system. But if they had looked at the data more objectively, they couldn't possibly come to their conclusions that they have.
Your cartoon said it earlier, confirmation bias.
Yep. So the major implication of this is over 100 years, a very small group of medical men concluded that a single germ caused a single disease. Other factors were of little or no concern, which led to the notion that antibiotics and vaccines were essential to eliminate the external threat. However, all the data unequivocally shows that other factors were far more critical than any microbe. So that doesn't mean there's not a microbe. For example, in whooping cough, there's a particular bacteria that can get in your lungs and it multiplies. So you can know that there's some kind of microbe in certain diseases. But they weren't that important because the death rate fell basically by 100% before there was a vaccine. And with vaccines, taken away, as in the case of Sweden, there's no increase in deaths. So we've overblown this whole idea that this germ is, you'll catch a germ and then you're going to get really sick and you're going to die. That was true in the 1800s, not in the mid 1900s.
But Roman, one of the things that we keep getting told is that, well, if everybody stopped with their vaccinations in the next 15 years, we're going to see an uptick in those diseases.
Well, you had 17 years in Sweden with no national vaccination program. There was no uptick. And as the data shows, we've hit zero, basically zero in deaths for measles, whooping cough, scarlet fever. All these types of diseases hit zero. So there's no deaths from these diseases, or virtually none. One of the things that are has really gone wrong is because that wasn't acknowledged. No one ever bothered to go figure out why the deaths fell by 100% before there was a vaccine. If they had, they would probably conclude that these things are not that important. So, what were all those big factors that actually changed things? And that's what got me curious, because I had these charts that showed these massive declines in mortality. And so I was like, well, what did cause it couldn't have been the vaccine unless vaccines can time travel. And it's not the antibiotics, because that came in way later too. So what was it? Digging in, I found out that the good old days where people wore top hats and people had lovely gowns and got into carriages and went to all sorts of balls and everything was wonderful was really just not real. So it was not the good old days. And this is from Velv Green. The good old days when everything's, particularly human health, is supposedly better today are a myth. The documented history of Western civilization describes an endless and unromantic struggle with sickness and death, tragically high infant mortality, and premature death of young adults. In Victorian England, that's the 1800s basically, the average age of death among the urban poor was 15 to 16 years. And there's a little cartoon there. Those are children going to a factory. It's a little poem about kids going to factory work. So again, there's references on the bottom right of where these quotes come from. And there's a reference for that picture. And that's a nice, lovely tenement in 1903. So one of the factors was hazardous housing. Narrow and crooked streets, want of proper sewage and ventilation, the absence of forethought in providing open spaces for the recreation of the people, the allowance of intramural, which is burying people in the walls, if you can believe that, and fetid nuisances such as slaughterhouses and manufacturers of offensive stuffs have converted cities into pestilent enclosures. So this is back when these cities exploded in population and they didn't have good transportation. And everything was done in the cities, slaughterhouses and manufacturing tanneries, and everything was inside of the cities, right next to all these tenements.
They buried people in walls.
Yeah, that's what they said, intramural, right? So, I don't know how often that happened, but that's pretty gross.
Can you imagine?
Yeah, it's a completely different world. Another big problem: sewage and contaminated water. The manner in which the great multitude of the poor is treated by society today is revolting. They are deprived of all means of cleanliness, of water itself. Their river is so polluted they are useless for such purposes. They are obliged to throw all offal and garbage, all dirty water, often all disgusting drainage and excrement into the streets. Being without other means of disposing of them, they are thus compelled to infect the regions of their own dwellings. 1844. So you can see that lovely toilet on the left. That's actually from my bathroom downstairs. That'd be really
and that was quoted by Friedrich Engels. Wasn't he the guy who funded Karl Marx?
Yeah. So one of the reasons I think that communism took place is because they saw some of the rich people. Friedrich Engels, went to England, and he saw the poor were living like vermin, basically. And so he saw some of the rich people, doing quite well. And I'm sure he formulated the idea, well, that doesn't seem fair. Why are the rich people have everything and the poor people have nothing and they're living like, rats? Actually, toilets were an advancement. They didn't have that at all. If you had to go to the bathroom where you went, you threw it out the window. The factories were dumping all their stuff and your neighbors were throwing all their waste into the streets, which would then get washed into the rivers. All the animals who were in the area, horses and cows and pigs, they went to the bathroom. Guess where? Well, they'd actually go to the bathroom. They just went in the streets, and all that got washed into your rivers, your water supply.
That's an interesting side thought. This conversation about vaccines focuses on humans. Do you think the same principle has applied to animals?
I never really looked deeply into animal vaccines at all, but it's basically the same premise. So I would think it's carries over to that. So again, you're basically living in a giant communal industrial toilet, and that's where you get your drinking water from. So that's obviously not going to be good for your health. People were basically drowning in dung. So this is streets in New York City. The condition of the streets with the masses of mud and manure and other monstrous agglomeration of everything dangerous, unsightly, and offensive is plainly indicated. Barrels and pails overladen with material mingled with foul mess of garbage and ashes beset the sidewalks. And you can see that picture just filled with horse dung. And it was a big problem. They didn't even know what to do. They were trying to clean it up. Sometimes horses would just die in the street and they just left them there because they're heavy animals. So how are you going to get rid of them? So they waited till they rotted down a little bit and they would just cut them up. So there was flies and all the manure and mud would get onto your shoes and you would drag it into your homes. So this was a disgusting, hideously smelling mess.
I actually read something yesterday, I think it was, about exactly what you're talking about. When cars started being introduced, there were a lot of people using horses. And so they created separate lanes because the cars couldn't drive over all the horse turd.
Yeah. There was thousands and thousands of these horses in these cities. What do you know? Horses aren't going to wait till they're somewhere. They're just going to go wherever they're going to go. And it just built up. And ultimately, and that's one of the solutions was, automobiles. They caused their own problems, but they certainly took care of this problem. So again, this is some of the stuff that would be going into your water supply as well. Coal was one of the most deadly things during the 1800s, starting in the late 1700s. So the evil effects of town air upon plant life, human lungs, also often attributed to the preventable smoke, are in like manner due to the non-preventable sulfuric acid. 16 million tons of coal are annually used in London for heating purposes. There it diffuses into the air of the metropolis from 500,000 to 1 million tons of sulfuric acid every year. It has been proved that the death rate enormously expands in foggy weather. When they used to talk about the London fog, it was really mostly all the soot going up into the atmosphere. People were also dying from coal mining. Huge numbers of people died from coal mining, but also imagine all this smoke going up into the air as just standard practice. So not only were you living in a toilet, an industrial communal toilet, you're also living in a chimney. This smoke was going on all the time because you had no other way to heat. And the factories and the houses were all be using coal. Food supply was not good. It was all diseased. So milk sold in Chicago came from cows fed on whiskey slops with their bodies covered with sores and tails all eat off. A circumstance which enabled the editorial critic to explain why so many children die in Chicago. New York's milk supply was also largely a byproduct of local distilleries, and the milk dealers were charged with a serious offense of murdering 8,000 children every year. And you can see on the picture on the right, that's a child suffering from milk poisoning. So as you might imagine, if you don't have anything to keep food fresh and your animals are sick because they're drinking from the same horrible toilet water that you're going to have diseased food. It's not going to be any good. It's not going to be good quality. And because you're not refrigerating it, it's also going to turn putrid and rotten pretty quickly. And if you have all those flies flying around, all the horse crap, they're going to be landing on your food. So it's just going to be a complete disaster.
Roman, what do you think happened, let's say, 500 years or 1,000 years ago? Is this trend of disease and illness and sickness, is it a constant, what's the word? In other words, is it a constant acceleration or deceleration, or do you think it's erratic throughout the ages?
I don't know because I didn't look anything earlier than the 1600s, 1700s. It's difficult to say because the further you go back in time, the less data you have, right? So I never really looked into it. But I imagine, based on all this reading, that if you're living in a particularly clean way and you're not in these big, huge cities all jammed up together, that things were pretty good. You didn't have to worry about that too much.
I get the impression that it wasn't too bad depending on where you might have been geographically. If you were in the countryside, for example, 700 years ago in Europe, you probably weren't doing too badly.
Yeah, I think we'll see some data later on that speaks to that. That even in London in the 1700s, the death rate wasn't horrible, except if you were the poor. If you were the poor, then it was a problem. But overall, the death, people lived to be in their hundreds or even older. There were documented people living into like 150. So people
Sure.
lived to 130, 150. So people did, fairly well. A lot of people lived into their 80s, 90s, 100s. Not as much as maybe today, but back then that was, it was quite surprising to see people live to be quite elderly. Another problem, food supply, of course. You have the miserable, starving poor. In France, beggars are so numerous and people die of hunger. In Canada during the winter, many are starved to death. In Buenos Aires, numbers live off of waste. In Upper Peru, the natives eat animals that die of disease. The Chinese do the same and likewise convert other disgusting matter into food. In Norway and Sweden, the people mixed their bread with sawdust, and that's in 1836. So again, food supply was not great all the time, for sure. And we just referred to that gross overcrowding. The most deadly feature of the new towns was the close proximity of human beings to each other. For example, the report of a health officer in Darlington in the 1850s found 6 children aged between 2 and 17 suffering from smallpox in a one-room dwelling shared with their parents, an elder brother, and uncle. They all slept together on rags on the floor with no bed. Millions of similar cases could be cited, with conditions getting even worse as disease victims died and their corpses remained rotting among the families in single-room accommodations for days as families scraped together the pennies to bury them. Can you imagine that? Being stuffed into a room with, a dozen people or half a dozen people? Someone dies of a disease and you just have to leave them there rotting. How could anything be healthy in that kind of environment? Imagine the trauma you have to suffer to live like this. And then there's brutal and punishing work. Women for the work of trouser finishing. This one lady, that poor soul, works 17 hours. She eats her crusts and drinks a little tea as she works, making, in very truth, with her needle and thread, not her living wage, but her shroud. In St. George's in the East End, large numbers of women and children, some of the latter only 7 years old, are employed in sack snaking. People worked like dogs. Some people worked 12 to 16 hours a day as a rule. It was quite brutal. Women often turned to prostitution just to make ends meet. It was not easy. It's not an easy life at all. Again, they were living in a giant communal industrial toilet with smoke, lack of food, and working to death. Children of all ages down to 3 and 4 were found the hardest, most painful labor. Imagine at 3 or 4 years old. Babes of 6 were commonly found in large numbers in factories. Labor from 12 to 13 and often 16 hours a day was the rule. Children had not a moment free save to snatch a hasty meal or sleep as best as they could. From earliest youth, they worked to the point of extreme exhaustion without open-air exercise or any enjoyment whatever, but grew up, if they survived at all, weak, bloodless, miserable, in many cases deformed cripples and victims of almost every disease. 1890. The picture on the left is breaker boys. Children were working in these mines. Just unimaginable, hardship for these children. I'm sure they didn't have good food, just brutal. Neglected care, which is kind of what we've been talking about. Small children of 5, 7, 9 years of age work in a bending position until 9 or 10 o'clock in these factories. The anemic, tired, nervous, overworked children are driven until they cry out against the abuse. A girl 7 years old had worked sitting in the hot sun while she was sick with measles. The lack of care at the time was followed by her death. So did she die from measles, or did she die because she was starving and hungry and tired and overworked and sitting in the hot sun and no care and eating polluted food? And here's a distressing picture here of New York cellar prisoners. These children were found. They were just basically slaves that lived inside this horrible condition in a filthy cellar. Another big factor, deadly medicine. And this is from Samuel Dixon, MD, 1855. For upwards of 23 centuries, to starve, bleed, purge, and torture had been the all but exclusive business of the man of medicine. From the days of Hippocrates to the last few years, this was undoubted the practice in almost all diseases. In truth, no question was ever asked by the public at large about medical matters. The possession of a diploma or degree from a school or university of reputation was the only requisite for practice. The practice itself, no matter how destructive, signified little so long as it was the established practice. Has anything changed since then? Back in those times, they were using bleeding, they were using toxic medications like mercury in the form of calomel. And this is a sketch of somebody who was given calomel, which is mercury. And the result was his tongue swelled up to enormous proportions. They did all sorts of crazy stuff to people. Another factor, vaccination. This is from Henry Hanchett, MD, 1889. Vaccination is a filthy thing, a useless thing, a harmful thing. These diseases, syphilis, scrofula, syphilis, tuberculosis, typhoid, diphtheria, Bright's disease, relapsing fever, septicemia, and cancer in exchange for smallpox, doesn't seem like a very good bargain. So he's talking about all these diseases caused by vaccination. Vaccination back then was not taking a hypodermic needle and injecting it into you. What they did is they took a lancet, which is a sharp instrument, and they cut you repeatedly on your arm in little scratches. And then they would take pus from either earlier from somebody who had smallpox, that was before vaccination. And later on, it was from an animal. It could have been a horse. It could have been a cow, could have been a goat. And then they went from arm to arm to arm for 100 years. And that's what vaccination was. So as you can imagine, if you took pus from somebody's arm and smeared it into an open wound on your arm, it's probably going to end up with some kind of problems. And it often did. So that was another, huge problem. Here's a article from the Poor Man's Guardian in 1847. Here's a beautiful picture. You can see tons of beds. It's not a picture. It's, of course, a sketch because they didn't have photography back then. And the top floors, you can see jammed up places to sleep. The middle one is jammed with people, all dejected. And the bottom is a cellar where people also lived. And this guy talked about the first house I went into was from its dirt and then effluvia, both sickening and disgusting. It was taken first into the cellar. The truly offensive state of this place beggars all description. I scarcely know where the sense of seeing or sense of smelling was the most shocked and offended. On all sides, I was surrounded by the most filthy abominations, and the smell was so truly overpowering that I thought I should have been compelled, for my own preservation, to have immediately retired. This just gives you an example of how a lot of people lived during that time. Here's just a little sketch of 1865 London. You can see lots of people around, people probably on the left sweeping up horse dung, and it's crowded with lots and lots of people. The streets just filled with who knows what. So the major factors for the disease, which we just kind of went through: hazardous housing, sewage and contaminated water, drowning in dung, deadly cold, diseased food, the miserable starving poor, gross overcrowding, brutal and punishing work, child labor, neglected care, deadly medicine, and vaccination. These all combine together to cause a very bad situation. So it was a miserable life. And what I'm talking about here is kind of what we talked about, living in the giant, toilet filled with smoke, just horrible tenements and all this kind of stuff put together. And it's hard to imagine anyone being healthy in such a horrifying condition. So it's a big takeaway. Life before the mid-1900s was often horrific and simply a struggle to survive. A combination of many factors resulted in many rampant diseases, suffering, and short life expectancy for many.
You're making a very strong case for environmental factors and almost a non-existent case for viral contagion, for example. Is there any evidence of the latter?
As we saw with the data, most of these problems went to, the death rate went to zero, virtually zero in almost every case. So let's say take scarlet fever. There's a bacteria that's involved with that. And now we just call it strep throat. There's a particular bacteria that could be sitting in your throat and maybe multiplying, but it's not the whole picture as we've been led to believe, because the death rate went to zero. There might be a microbe involved, but it's not the most important thing at all. And in the case of, I'm kind of on the fence of, whether there's a virus or not. There's certain things that don't fit either pattern. It's certainly not a big deal. But let's say measles, for example, because measles mortality rate would be near zero if we didn't have these horrible situations. But there's an example of, let's say, the Faroe Islands, and I read the original report from there. I'm hard pressed to think of something that's not a contagion in that particular case, because they had measles 65 years earlier before they had measles again. And as the person described in his report, you could almost see it spreading through the population. And the people who had measles 65 years earlier did not get measles. That was like 95 different people. So, I tried to think of what could be another explanation, but I never really thought of anything. So I'm kind of on the fence with this whole microbe thing. But to me, it doesn't really matter because your death rate is near zero. As we saw in Sweden, no vaccination program, whooping cough death, basically near zero. So we've made this thing into a giant fiasco because our collective memory may have remembered the 1800s as being this deadly time. And now we don't have it, but we've made this false correlation that it was because of the vaccine or because of antibiotics, which is not true. The data shows that. And I think the explanation is how people lived back then. And if we don't live like that, we shouldn't be having these huge problems.
The bottom line is that no vaccine, according to the data, has ever eradicated a disease.
Yeah, I believe that is true. I mean, there's the argument for smallpox, but I think when you look at what really happened, that doesn't hold water either.
And conversely, could it be argued that vaccines have only had a either neutral or negative effect?
I think that certainly the original vaccine, the smallpox vaccine, was highly toxic. It was highly deadly, and we'll cover that. And it probably killed a lot more people than it did anything, because I don't think it did anything in the first place, because it doesn't make any sense once you realize what it was. So what changed? So we're going to talk about the health revolution. It's not true each individual must run the gamut of measles, scarlet fever, whooping cough, diphtheria, tuberculosis, and the like. If proper precautionary measures be taken at the outset, sunshine, fresh air, wholesome nutrition, exercise, rest, and the hygienic mode of living are far more effectual than all the subsequent medication in existence. So in 1911, there are people, actually the late 1800s into the early 1900s, there are people that realized that the solution was this: sunshine, fresh air, good nutrition, exercise, and rest. And here's our little cartoon from the American Medical Association in 1914. You can see on the stairway to health is pure food, sanitation, fresh air, regular hours, temperate living. Enormous changes happened over the decades. These are the things that I think are the most critical. This is from Life magazine in 1941. Life for children in this country has been made infinitely safer. We have reduced death from principal communicable diseases of childhood, measles, scarlet fever, whooping cough, diphtheria, to a new record low, a point actually promising complete eradication of these diseases, which is exactly what happened. Scarlet fever went to zero, whooping cough, diphtheria went to zero, all these things went to zero basically. So what are all those changes? Clean public water, pipes and sewers. Didn't have that before. Hygienic movement, hand washing, getting rid of the horrible sewer apartments, dreadful housing, just crazy stuff. How people lived like that, I have no idea. Get rid of the slaughterhouses, tanneries, or away from the cities, move them to the outskirts. Improve milk supplies so they're not filled with, they used to put formaldehyde into milk trying to keep it from rotting away. And of course, all the cows were sick, so we got rid of that. Better child feeding practices, unions and labor laws. So back then, you didn't have any say in anything. You just tried to survive. So they started putting laws in place so that you weren't being abused by your employers. Child labor laws, no more. It was incremental. So first 4-year-olds were taken away from labor, 7-year-olds, 10-year-olds, 12-year-olds, and it went up so that eventually children weren't working anymore. Public schools, which were far better. I know some people don't like public schools these days, but back then it was far better than working in a mine shaft. And so you could learn how to read and write and, better yourself. Health departments who were cleaning up some of all these horrible messes. Proper food handling, so people got fruits and vegetables and just overall better nutrition. Electricity, biggest invention ever, which gave you refrigeration. Now you have transportation, so now you have cars and trucks replacing horses, and the flush toilet. All these things came in about the same time. Tackling water and air pollution, reducing toxic medical notions, bleeding, and medications like mercury and arsenic. These were not very smart ideas. Decreasing smallpox vaccinations were highly toxic, so those went down. And general rise in standard of living. and really just overall far better structured and healthy societies. So you had all these things come together. And that's really, in my opinion, and I think all the information supports that, this is what changed everything. So you went from life like this, which was quite horrifying, that slowly transformed over the decades to life like this. So that was the real transformation that we don't appreciate, or most of us don't. So it's the world's greatest health revolution that we don't know about. Life on the left to life on the right. Which would you like? I don't care what your political position. I don't think anybody wants to live life on the left. But I could have switched the pictures, but maybe I should have done that. So otherwise, this becomes political. The picture on the left with the dejected, horrible, suffering children on the left and the bottom left, working in a factory.
I know you didn't want to bring in politics, but it is actually probably accurate that if it were left wing, because let's say communism, whatever, right, is on the left, that is how it would have been.
Well, so not really. I mean, things improved even in the Soviet era. Soviet era is the same as it did in the Western world. So it's really the advent of technologies. All these other things happened across various nations. So it wasn't just really just communism stayed to the left there, which wouldn't be true. And then so you have the picture on the bottom right with all different types of children all having a nice time in their school. This is kind of like what my school would have been like in the 70s, with the guy with hands up in the air in the back. So, having a nice day, smiling and pretty healthy, whereas on the left, not so much. So deadly childhood diseases became mild. Only comparatively few years ago, the death toll from these groups of diseases, measles, scarlet fever, whooping cough, and diphtheria, the principal communicable diseases of childhood, was serious. But it has now been reduced to the point where a complete suppression may be expected. The public health movement is said to be responsible for the reduction in mortality. Advances in sanitary science, including pasteurization of milk, the better refrigeration of foods, the purification of water supplies, as well as a general rise in the standard of living, are the main reasons for this improvement. So this is in 1941. So there are people that appreciated that what changed is what fixed things. And this is why we had a better quality of life in the Western world. But the medical men that were invested in vaccination and other ideas pushed this other idea of how they were going to handle the problems which are already taken care of. The main message from the mid-1800s to the mid-1900s was nothing short of a miraculous societal and health transformation. Numerous changes accomplished by millions of people, activists, public health officials, inventors, scientists, engineers, plumbers, electricians, teachers, health advocates, and many more took our world from an era overshadowed by the specter of infectious diseases to an epoch of prosperity, relative health, and well-being. Yet that extraordinary health revolution has been primarily forgotten and replaced by a mythology that medical interventions such as antibiotics and vaccines were responsible. We thought this was true, and it wasn't these medical interventions at all. So how did we get trapped in this false narrative that vaccines and medications saved us? So to find out, we need to go back a few hundred years. You ready for time travel? So we're going to start with smallpox and inoculation. And this is from Thomas Sydenham, 1688. And he has a very interesting thing here to say that's going to apply throughout the rest of this presentation and then the conclusion of the smallpox section. So if no mischief be done either by physician or nurse, smallpox is the most slight and safe of all other diseases. So what he's saying here is smallpox is not a big deal, which is kind of something that you wouldn't think is true. So we were talking about life in London in the 1700s, and here we have deaths per age group from 1728 to 1758. So this is 1700s. And so in this age range, 1/3 of the deaths, really 45% of the deaths, were children under 5, and they were basically in the poor children. And then from there, you can see that, there's a bell curve going up. So some people made it in their 40s or 50s. people's made it in their 50s, 60s, and quite a few people made it into their later years. And about 2.5% lived to be 80 or older. So, quite a few people made it to a little bit older than we might imagine. They weren't all dying when they were young. And this is in London with no modern conveniences whatsoever. Oh, yeah. So Isaac Massey, commented that most of the problems are the miserable poor and parish children make up half the mortality of the bills of mortality. They didn't have national statistics till 1838. So bills of mortality in London were the thing they used to keep track of deaths. 1717, this Lady Wortley Montagu came up with this idea because she had been visiting Constantinople. And so that she came back and wrote her letter to Sarah Criswell and said, there's this smallpox treatment here. It's called engrafting, which later they would call inoculation or variolation. She kind of kicked off this whole idea of inoculation. They started inoculating in 1701, but it was not a very safe procedure. The protection against smallpox by no means was a mild one. It had been reckoned that 2 or 3 persons died out of every 100 inoculated, so 2 or 3% death rate from the medical procedure. Isaac Massey also commented that inoculation is the art of giving smallpox to a person in health who might have otherwise lived many years and perhaps to a very old age without it, whereby some unhappily come to an untimely death. What they would do for inoculation, they would take some sharp instrument, and they would scratch your arm, and then they would take pus from somebody else's arm that had smallpox or somebody who had died from smallpox and basically smear it into your wound. Isaac Massey thought it was like pretty crazy, and he would call it incantation instead of inoculation. And he also noticed that in his hospitals, he would often have about 600 children there. And over 20 years, there was only 5 or 6 deaths from smallpox. So it was not a big problem, according to him. So why were they doing this new procedure, which he called incantation? He was totally against this whole idea. 1724, here's an example of a child from Mrs. Ann Rolt. This new practice of inoculation was baseless claims of safety. So in 1724, she was convinced by her friends to basically have her child inoculated. And the inoculator said, oh, it's not going to be a big deal. We don't have to do any preparation. Your child will play well. In 9 weeks after the inoculation, after the most miserable suffering that ever poor creature underwent, she died worn to nothing but skin and bone. They would promise certain things and then didn't work out. And what's interesting is the inoculators would blame the child for why the child died. They would say she had this or that. That was her fault, not our fault. An interesting thing is about the same time, medicine was doing crazy stuff. So here's actually things that they would use for particular conditions: burnt owls, burnt swallows, cat's brains, powdered blood of white puppy dogs, wolf guts, old man's urine, sheep excrements. Doesn't sound very scientific to me, but this is some of the things they were using still in the 1700s. At the same time, they thought of this inoculation incantation procedure. A big thing they were doing from, I don't know when they started this, but certainly through the 1700s into the 1800s, bleeding, which is now generally practiced among us, where smallpox is expected even when it's just made its appearance. I advise bleeding copiously. I advise to everyone indiscriminately without regard to age, sex, or temperament. I advise to give a vomit. This medicine evidently to calculate to cleanse empty the whole alimentary tube, which it will purge as well as vomit. So they would give you something like calomel or some other purgative, they would call it. And it would cause you to go out one side and the other side at the same time until you were completely emptied. Sounds very pleasant. At the same time, they would bleed you repeatedly until the point where you've passed out, almost passed out, or until you were faint. This was the medical notion of the time, and it lasted for a long time. If you had smallpox or you were inoculated, they would do this procedure. They would do these things. So, were you dying from smallpox or were you dying from these procedures? Another thing they did, it was called the hot regimen. So this was commonly used for smallpox, hot regimen. This method, individuals affected with disease would be covered in numerous smothering blankets, encourage copious sweating with the aim of eliminating excessive body fluids. This is after you were bled and purged. Patients might be immersed in a hot bath. This therapeutic fashion viewed light and fresh air is detrimental, leading patients to be kept in darkness wherever feasible with minimal ventilation. According to John Mason Good, MD, the practice of treating the disease smallpox was cordials, which are these kind of drinks to get rid of all of your fluids. And hot regimen at the time prevailed, and it was too generally applied to the inoculated as well as to the natural process, which is natural smallpox, by means of which the former was often tendered a severe and in many cases a fatal disease. Not only were you bled often and frequently, you were also subject to these toxic medications to purge your whole canal this way and that way. And then you were also put in a hot regimen, so you were deprived of fresh air and smothered. So here's another thing that was not very good for your health. There were people that noticed that over the 1700s that smallpox became worse. So while they were inoculating and they understood the disease better, we had a 47% increase in smallpox deaths, according to Robert Walker, MD. So things didn't get better over the 1700s, despite increasing medical knowledge, as you will. So here's a chart. This is from the London Bills of Mortality. The first part is the green part before they started inoculating. Then they started inoculating, which was widely accepted in that red zone. And then by that point, deaths from smallpox had increased by about 50%. So inoculation didn't help the situation at all. It made it worse. A few people noticed, but basically inoculation became a thing with the medical system. So, they didn't want to get rid of it. After 80 years of inoculation was what was next. So they were looking for something different, not realizing that the health conditions that they were living in were bad, not really realizing that these medical notions were horrible. So they were looking for something else, and really set the stage for this newfangled idea by Edward Jenner, which was cowpoxing, which was later renamed as vaccination. So we had 80 years of inoculation, which didn't work, but we're going to do something different again. So this is from Dr. Magandy. I'm not sure how you say his name. Medicine is a great humbug. I know it's called a science. Science indeed is nothing like a science. Doctors are mere empirics, which means experimenters when they are not charlatans. We are ignorant as men can be. Nobody knows anything about medicine. I repeat to you, there is no such thing as medical medicine. This guy was a famous doctor, and he realized that they were just experimenting and trying things. And there was quite a few doctors that, figured this out too. And so they called out their own profession saying, hey, we don't know what we're doing. We just put things in books and do things and then hope for the best. And then once we start doing things, we keep on doing them. And inoculation and vaccination are no exception to this. So in 1798, this guy, Edward Jenner, after kind of pondering this for a while and listening to rumors that milkmaids were immune to smallpox, came up with this idea that instead of taking pus and blood from somebody's arm who had smallpox, he's going to take pus and blood from somebody who had supposed cowpox. And actually, he thought it wasn't from a cow at all. He thought it was from a disease called the grease on horses that was transmitted to cows, but that wasn't really true either. But that's what he thought. He also thought it might be from goats too. So he suggested goat pox was a good idea too. What's interesting is 1 year after that, a Dr. Drake inoculated smallpox on 3 children, thinking they should be protected with this new procedure, but they all developed smallpox. So it failed right there. But it became a big medical thing. It was quite popular, very fast, because it had been promoted by the wealthy people and the royalty. So people started getting vaccinated. So by 1801, 100,000 people were vaccinated in England. Another experiment, they vaccinated 49 children in this town of Brunswick, but 6 months later, 45 children came down with smallpox. A professor went to go find out, let's figure out what this massive failure was. But he said, we're not going to stop. We're not going to abandon vaccination. And according to Charles Crichton in 1890, the professor is certainly non-posthumous. We cannot, because he and his class of the continent, as well as in England, had already been deeply committed. So basically, it didn't matter if it didn't work because they were already kind of, all in on it. 1802, Edward Jenner petitions the House of Commons. And so he talks about vaccination, perfect ease and safety, and is attended with the singularly beneficial effect of rendering through life the person so inoculated perfectly secure from the infection of smallpox, which wasn't true at all, as we already seen that didn't work. 1805, a few years later, William Raleigh, MD, wrote a book, Cowpox Inoculation, No Security Against Smallpox Infection. And he saw out of 504 people, 75 died from the consequences of the vaccination. In the space of 7 or 8 years from 1798, when this whole thing started, to 1805, vaccination has shown itself so grievous to society. What may we not fear for the future? So this is only a few years later. I guess he's one of the first anti-vaxxers because he saw that it wasn't working and it was deadly. Children having had smallpox from 2 months to 6 years after passing through regular vaccination with scars on both arms, that's where they would scratch your arm repeatedly and smear pus into it, like other vaccination extravagances, is perfectly refuted by the facts. So he saw that it didn't work because they got smallpox. What's interesting is Dr. Raleigh noted that those who didn't conform to the already firmly established doctrine of vaccination would be labeled as traitors. The prevailing social and political climate compelled the majority to adopt the allegiance to vaccination. Besides deluding parents, threatening them unmercifully if they dared to disclose vaccination errors, and they remained silent under their sorrows, others, through respect to their medical practitioners, will neither admit to their own nor doctors' names to be published for fear of giving offense. Others are cajoled or forced to say or do anything vaccination fallacies choose to dictate. 1805. Has anything changed? Basically, Dr. Raleigh is saying, this whole thing is being engineered. You're not getting the truth because people are being forced. And we have to stay with whatever the vaccine fallacy says, that you're going to be perfectly secure, which wasn't true. And it's perfectly safe, which wasn't true. And this is only a few years after. It's already embedded into their consciousness. Another doctor, the state of vaccination in 1810. Merely a decade after vaccination became all the medical rage, that's key, medical rage, Charles McLean, MD, penned an extensive book delving into the shortcomings of vaccination practice, presenting tables filled with names. And I read the book. There's actual names of each individual, accompanied by references, which revealed a staggering 535 cases of smallpox emerging after cowpox inoculation. The 150 fatalities resulting either from smallpox or adverse reactions to cowpox after cowpox vaccination. In his book, he wrote all these names down, but no one seemed to care because it was already a rage. So he said very few deaths from cowpox appear in the bills of mortality owing to the means which they have been used to suppress the knowledge of them. Neither were deaths, disease, and failures transmitted in great abundance from the country, not because they did not happen, but because some practitioners were interested in not seeing them, and others who did see them were afraid of announcing what they knew. Is that any different than today? So it's not that the deaths didn't happen from cowpoxing or vaccination. It's just that no one wanted to see it. No one wanted to report it. This is 1810. This is only a decade after this craziness started. And this is John Birch, member of the Royal College of Surgeons, surgeon to His Royal Highness, the Prince of Wales. I consider natural smallpox a mild disease and only rendered malignant by mistakes in nursing and diet and in medicine and by want of cleanliness. It would hardly be too bold to say that the fatal treatment of this disease, the fatal treatment of the disease for 2 centuries by warming, which we talked about, hot regimen and confining the air of the chamber, and by stimulating with heating cordials was the cause of 2/3 of the mortality which ensued. So here he's noticed they weren't dying from the smallpox, which was mild. They were dying from the treatment and their cleanliness conditions. 1820, 2 decades later, cases of smallpox after cowpox are becoming so common as no longer to excite any interest. In one family we lately met with 7 children that ended up with smallpox, all of whom had been vaccinated some 8 years and others 4 years ago. So that, it just became like, oh, you're getting smallpox anyway, but it didn't matter. They kept on vaccinating anyway because it was a thing. It was a medical thing now. 1852. This is for treating pneumonia. They're still doing bloodletting. They're still using tartar emetic and mercury and opium after bleeding. So they're still doing these procedures at which people were beginning to recognize were a bad idea, but they were still doing them, causing problems where there wouldn't have been problems in the first place. So this is, interesting. So this is 1883. So we still have crazy things going on in medicine. The fact that the insanity of women has become doubled is frequently during the last 25 years ascribed to the increase of uterine disease, related to some remarkable cases of hysterical insanity, which were cured by the ultimate recognition treatment of uterine disorder. So they thought it was in the woman's womb that was causing this insanity, they called it. Notice there's 50,000 female patients now secluded in lunatic asylums. There were many cases posed incurable insanity, which were really only a result of unsuspected uterine disease. So they were saying hysteria or insanity was because of their uterus. And that's where we get hysteria from, hysterectomy. You see the picture there. Those are the chains they used to bind people with. 1885, cages, iron chains, handcuffs, hobbles, straps, crib beds, and fixed chairs are common modes of restraint of patients who are being afforded no means of occupation or diversion of the mind naturally become noisy and troublesome. Gee, I wonder why. They'd put them in, immerse them in to tranquilize them. A covered shower bath, person is subjected to a continuous downpour of water. Isn't that water torture? I think it is. Yeah, waterboarding. So they would just basically just try to control them and torture them. Patients confined unable to move for 12 hours at a time. In many instances, unattended at temperatures of 34 degrees centigrade, often with cold water dripping on their head. In one institution, I saw 215 women in various modes of restraints, camisoles, wristlets, straps, etc., secured upright in racks around the day rooms. In another, there were 43 women in box beds, ironed hand and foot, and extended in spread eagle fashion. The picture on the left is a box bed which a woman lived in naked for 43 years. This is the state of insane medicine in the 1800s. How many people did they torture and kill this way is just mind-boggling.
It's like something from a Gotham story.
You wouldn't even believe it. Imagine living in that box for 43 years. How would you not be crazy after one day? Horrible. It's like living in a coffin. So what was vaccination? This is Dr. Gifford, 1888. It's a convenient habit of vaccinators to speak of vaccination in his uniform, as if the virus of the right were definite as a drop of water, a pinch of salt, or a grain of gold. Nothing could be further from the truth. So what they did is they would put the stuff on your arm and then they would transfer from body to body and they did that for 100 years. Take the pus from your arm and put it onto the next person's arm. To these Jennerian stocks, which is what they called, Jenner's cowpox stuff, they added smallpox cowpox obtained by inoculating cows with the virus of pus from human smallpox. So they would take it from a human who had smallpox and scratch it onto a cow. So that was called human smallpox, smallpox cowpox. Thus, we have a virus derived from a horse grease cowpox because Jenner thought it came from a horse. So you have smallpox people and horse grease people, and natural spontaneous cowpox from horsepox and from smallpox cowpox, thus plus the constitutional taints of generation of vaccinifers. Vaccinifers were the people who had vaccine material in their arms, and so they're going to take it from this arm to this arm to this arm to this arm. So he's talking about it's contaminated with all the stuff from their arms through which all these first poxes have passed. So he's talking about all these different combinations of different things that vaccines really were. It wasn't just cowpox. It's been, people say, oh, it was the cowpox virus. No, it wasn't that at all. It was a mix of lots of things. So this diagram is going to attempt to show you what a vaccine really was. The idea was, gee, it comes from a cow, and we're going to take that stuff and we're going to scratch it under your arm. But Jenner really thought it was from a horse. Actually, he thought it was from goats too. So you had these different ideas. But different animals were used at different times. In India, they used buffalo. They also used donkeys. There was swine pox, and there was also sheep that were used, and they even used rabbits. So it went through all these different kinds of animals. A lot of people thought it was somebody who died from smallpox, or somebody who had smallpox, or somebody who had a blanket on them that had smallpox, and they would scratch that onto a cow. Ultimately, there was three main ideas that no one could figure out over many decades. It was either coming from a cow, or it came from a horse, as Jenner liked, or other people liked, or it came from somebody who had smallpox scratched onto a cow. That was the main ideas. And then, as we talked about, for 100 years, they would do arm-to-arm vaccination. So they would take the pus from one person's arm and scratch it onto the next person's arm and next person's arm and next person's arm. And that's how they moved it all around. Sometimes they determined somehow that the vaccine wasn't so potent anymore. So they would take vaccine material from a person and scratch it onto a cow and then back to a person, then back to another animal and back and forth and back and forth. And they called it retro vaccination. And of course, you might imagine that there would be bacteria, yeast, and fungus in all these different concoctions. And they actually, at the end of the 1800s, they found out there was filled with bacteria in these little concoctions. And so that's basically what a vaccine was. So it wasn't just about a cow. It was pus and blood from a variety of animals: cows, horses, goats, pigs, sheep, mules, donkeys, buffaloes, rabbits, and humans, including corpses of those who died from smallpox, microbes and chemicals scratched on the people with the intention of protecting from smallpox. Each scratch a person received was a haphazard gamble as to what was in that mystery brew. So it was really a combination of different things. And George Winterburn, he had a really good book, The Value of Vaccination. When was that written? 1886. So the whole foundation of vaccination, millions of vaccinations are made every year and nobody knows what they're made with. The whole process of haphazard gamble, game of chance. This is a letter that Dr. Hodge got after repeated letters to a vaccine company, and they finally acknowledged that the state of the vaccine virus is very little is known about it, that they're scratching onto cows, and they admitted that they thought it was a cow, but actually it was smallpox from some tramp who had slept in the stable. So that's where that vaccine material came from, and this is in the early 1900s. And we talked about how they would scratch people on the arm and then put the pus in. So the surgeon sat on a box in the storeroom, lancet, which is a sharp instrument. You can see some of them on the left. In hand around him were huddled as many as could be crowded into a confined space, old and young, children screaming, women crying, each with an arm bare. The lymph, which was the vaccine material used, was of unknown origin, kept in a capillary tube, from whence it was blown into a cup, into which the lancet was dipped. No pretense of cleaning of the lancet was made. It was drew blood in very many instances. So people would just do these things in crowded rooms and scratch the person's arm and smear some stuff in their arm, and off they went and kept on doing it. And they could do dozens a day, hundreds a day. This is called a vaccine point. It was just made from ivory usually. And they would put the material in there and they could just basically smear that into your wound or jam it in. According to William White, some of the vaccinators use real instruments of torture. Ivory points are driven into the flesh and wounds ensue, which become surreptitious and in the delicate constitution of weakly children fatal. As you might imagine, putting blood and pus from some unknown origin and sticking it into some little kid's arm is probably not going to end very well for the kid. Now, again, we think of a vaccination as this nice and cute little needle that you stick in somebody's arm, but that's not the way it was, as we just talked about. The picture on the left was considered a good arm. You would get a bunch of little wounds, they would pus up, and that was considered a good vaccination. But 1 in 10 people had bad arms, like the guy on the right, with a big, giant, gaping hole and high-grade fever. That's what vaccination was back in the 1800s.
But Roman, wouldn't a counter-argument be, yeah, but that was back then.
Yeah.
It's all better. It's much better now.
Yeah, sure. They improved the process, but even by the early 1900s, it still was of unknown origin. Winterburn talks about this in 1886. There is much hardness and swelling in the connective tissue, while in extreme cases, the arm may become enormously swollen, so rigid as to be practically immovable. Development of the little wounds is accompanied by usual symptoms of erysipelas, and temperature continues low until the 4th day when it rises to 102, 104. On the 8th day, it's usually a sharp rise in temperature and pulse, restlessness, heat, dryness of skin, nausea, headache, nausea, diarrhea, swelling of the glands are present in varying intensity, are never altogether absent, even in the mildest cases. In fact, these secondary symptoms are looked upon all experienced vaccinators as making the effectiveness of the protection afforded by vaccination. So this was like standard procedure. You're supposed to get really sick when you got your vaccine. Keep in mind also, by the late 1800s, I think it was 1870 or so, your child had to be vaccinated by 3 months of age. Not 3 years of age, 3 months of age. So you had a young baby and you were forced to do it by law. When cultivating rottenness is once grafted into the groundwork of human flesh and blood, promulgating of disease germs is an inevitable consequence. Vaccine virus rot will evolve into almost any form of disease in the body: syphilis, septicemia, spinal meningitis, paralysis, partial or total blindness without visible changes to the eye, amputation of limbs, diphtheria, tetanus, phthisis, and finally death have too often been absolutely traced to this pernicious practice of vaccination. 1902, Dr. Hiller. By the way, when you read some of the modern literature, they're like, well, there's a couple of doctors that were, quacks that, didn't support vaccination. There were hundreds of doctors that were against this type of procedure, and we documented them in our new book too. There was quite a few doctors that noticed that this was a disaster. So what are some of the things that could happen with vaccination? Syphilis, leprosy, erysipelas, and people died from this stuff. In India, since the introduction of compulsory vaccination, leprosy has increased by 25%. Consumption, the white plague, has increased by 35%. Cancer, 50%. Skin diseases, 270%. So vaccination was spreading like illnesses and making people sick and killing people, not like the mythology tells us. So here's various doctors and all the references of the results of vaccination. Consumption follows in the footsteps of vaccination as certainly as and unequivocally as effect follows cause. This is Professor Wilder. Syphilis, scrofula, cancer, syphilis, and almost all diseases of skin have been or conveyed occasioned by intensified vaccination. Dismal results of vaccination in case of paralysis, blindness in both eyes, hip joint disease, consumption, and frightful forms of skin disease. Consumption, scrofula, and other blood diseases comparatively unknown before smallpox and cowpox inoculation were introduced. Hundreds of children in Brooklyn schools are inoculated with tuberculosis, which is the white plague. Various doctors stating what was happening with vaccination, what diseases were being transmitted. Here's a case of Miss Fanny Lent. She was vaccinated with a child and thereafter became a mass of running sores. Has since died. She suffered the tortures of hell. Another case, Benjamin, vaccinated in 1895, being then in good health and smooth of skin. About 2 months later, a sarcomatous tumor began to develop where the sore had not yet properly healed. The tumor continued to grow and spread until it reached an enormous proportions shown in cut. Look at the size of that thing, which was made from a photograph. Racked with intense pain and untold misery, suffering the most excruciating torments conceivable, the poor man was relieved only by laying down his life as a sacrifice on the altar to stupid indifference and professional incompetency. So here, this guy got a vaccine, scratched on his arm, and this is what happened. So after 70 years and forcing people to be vaccinated, it was almost 100% vaccination rate in England. They were fanatic about it and forcing people through various laws. We had a massive global smallpox epidemic. And here in London, the deaths from smallpox have assumed the proportions of a plague. Over 10,000 lives have been sacrificed during the past years in England and Wales. Of 9,392 patients in London smallpox hospital, no less than 6,800 had been vaccinated, nearly 73%. 122,000 vaccinated persons have suffered from smallpox. And this is in the medical journal The Lancet, 1871, showing that vaccination didn't work. When we looked at the data for all these other infectious diseases around 1875, and you can see here there's a dotted line in the middle of this chart, the Public Health Act, 1875. Deaths from various diseases started going down. Whooping cough, smallpox, scarlet fever, they all started going down. At the same time, so did smallpox, and so did enteric fever. So did the vaccination levels. They started going down too because people had gotten sick of it and they protested. In Leicester, England, 1885, they protested against vaccination and they overthrew their local government and they stopped vaccinating. And the medical people were screaming at them that they're all going to die, but that never happened. And then slowly over time, vaccination decreased over England. But as you can see in this chart, as vaccination rates decreased, so did all these diseases as well. And this is from Dr. Millard, 1914. This is a chart in his book. I don't think many doctors read it, or if they did, they ignored it. This is data from Leicester, England. 1885 is where they started they gave up on vaccination, and you can see the blue line, the vaccination rates dropped. Here, when vaccination rate was basically 100%, you have the massive spike up in 1871 to 1873 of vaccination deaths. And then as vaccination rates dropped, smallpox deaths were near zero. This is across all of England from 1873 to 1922. Again, the dotted blue line is vaccinations. And you can see they're going from like 80% down to 40%. When vaccination were high, smallpox was highest. As vaccination rates plummeted, smallpox deaths went towards zero. During the 1800s, there's a bunch of lines here, and there's different age ranges for children from 1 year all the way up to 20 years. That's all the various colored lines. The dotted blue line is the vaccination rate. And you can see from the 1838 to 1886, the death rate for children didn't change no matter how much they vaccinated. It basically stayed the same. It wasn't until 1875, vaccination rates drop, deaths for children all go down, 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 down. So did the vaccine do any good here? Doesn't seem that way to me. And the work of Dr. Robert Watt, by the way, this is in Vital Statistics of the United States from 1900 to 1930, this introduction. The deaths of children less than 10 years of age in Glasgow during the 30 years centering around the introduction of vaccination, and showed that smallpox decreased, other children's diseases increased, and that the child mortality had been little affected by the change. And that's what we just saw in that other chart. There was no change in the death rate for children at all. So what happened at the end of the 1800s? Smallpox became a mild disease. Smallpox and chickenpox are sometimes very difficult to differentiate clinically. I don't know how they told the difference anyway, but they couldn't tell the difference. That's what Thomas Sydenham said a long time earlier, and other doctors had said during those many decades that smallpox was mild. From a book, 1908, smallpox is mild. By 1913, the fatality rate of 20% in 1895 had dropped to 0.26%, 98.7% decrease. Here's a table from public health reports, and they show number of cases, number of deaths, case fatality rate, and then later 1930s. And we see that the smallpox death rate had dropped by almost 100%, 98.5%. So smallpox basically became a non-issue. At the same time, smallpox vaccination rates were dropping all over the place. So the past claims that smallpox was a mild disease by these various people, Thomas Sydenham, it's a mild disease, Isaac Massey, it's only a problem under ill management. John Birch, which we listened to earlier, smallpox is a very mild disease. Leverson, this guy, Dr. Matlock, treated hundreds of cases without a single fatality. And this guy, Dr. McLean, said you just have to take some apple cider vinegar and you'll have no problems in 1901. And again, vaccination rates were high throughout the 1800s until later 1800s. Vaccination rates began to fall by 1914, 50%, and by 1948, 18%. But there was no widespread smallpox in the Western world anymore. It became mild and just kind of faded away. Well, Dr. Millard wrote about this in the British Medical Journal. Vaccination is steadily declining ever since the conscientious clause was introduced. That meant you didn't have to get a vaccine. All you had to say, no, I don't want it. 2/3 of children born are not vaccinated, yet smallpox mortality has also declined until now quite negligible. This is Thomas Mack, MD. He was one of the people, boots on the ground. He probably was on the ground in all these other countries more than anybody else, any other doctor. And he said that disappearance of smallpox was facilitated, not impeded by economic development. Long before the World Health Organization smallpox eradication program began, smallpox disappeared from many countries as they developed economically. It's the people who are poor and living in horrible conditions that end up with problems. And he said also, if people are worried about endemic smallpox, because people were worried that it's going to come back and kill us, disappeared from this country, not because of our mass herd immunity, it disappeared because of our economic development. It's not from universal vaccination. Dr. Charles Crichton, one of the smartest doctors of his era, and you don't know about him because the books he wrote were really intelligent on British history, But then he was tasked with writing an article for the Encyclopedia Britannica about vaccination. And so he decided not to just use standard talking points. He actually did research and he dug into things. He wrote something in the encyclopedia that was not flattering to vaccination at all. And then he wrote 2 books on vaccination, which exposed a lot of information. It would be good for anybody interested in this to read those. Gender and Vaccination, a strange chapter in medical history. In there, there's so much information about some of the stuff that we talked about. He was just forgotten in history because he didn't support the medical paradigm, and he just faded from history, and he ended up, I think, just a poor broken man. Even though he was the smart guy, but smart doesn't always mean successful. It is difficult to conceive what will be the excuse for a century of cowpoxing, but it cannot be doubted that the practice will appear in as absurd a light to the common sense of the 20th century as bloodletting now does to us. Vaccination differs, however, from all previous errors of the faculty in being maintained as the law of the land on the warrant of medical authority. That is the reason why the blow to professional credit can hardly help being severe, and why the efforts to ward it off have been and will continue to be so ingenious. And we're still in the same boat. So looking at all this data and evidence, does it seem that history and vaccination commonly believed are based more on fantasy or fact? Thomas Jefferson said some really smart things because he was talking about these diseases, and the symptoms are so diversified that many associate them appear to be rarely established to a definitive disease. And because it's an unknown disease, there cannot be a known remedy. So the judicious, moral, and humane physician should stop and use nature to reestablish the disorder functions. He should rather trust to their action instead of just trying random things by conjectural experiments on a machine so complicated and so unknown as the human body, and a subject so sacred as the human life. Conjectural experiments on a machine so complicated and so unknown as the human body. That is an important thing to understand, that because that's what medicine has always been throughout the centuries. Let's try this. Let's try that. Let's try this. And you don't really know what it's really doing. And we've been doing that for centuries. I always think that if you're going to take something and you don't know how it really works, maybe you should not take it and actually rely on nature.
What would you say is the big takeaway from this entire conversation?
After doing this for way too many years, these diseases were not a big issue unless you were in the 1800s living in a sewer, breathing in toxic air, starving to death, have no nutrition. That by the mid 1900s, these things were not an issue. We just made them into an issue in our own imagination, that you don't need to worry about microbes. Your leading causes of death are your own poor health lifestyle choices and medical treatments. Medical treatments in the United States, several studies for the last 50 years show, basically 250,000 people dying, third leading cause of death every year, but there's no attention paid to it. And there were a lot of doctors in the early 1900s, in late 1800s, early 1900s, to recognize that the key to health were the things we talked about: sunshine, fresh air, good diet, rest, not overworking, these types of things. When people did those things, these disease states didn't manifest. The problem with that, there's no profit motive for these types of things. Taking care of your own personal health, nobody needs to do anything except maybe a farmer and a plumber. So if you take care of your health, then you're really not going to have a lot of medical problems. But we're not taught that. We're not given self-empowerment. So the people in the 50s, 60s, and 70s, they were doing pretty good. They didn't have these health problems. But now we forgot all that. And because we forgot all that, we're doing other stupid things like becoming obese across the planet. And we're not getting sunshine. Sunshine is very important. So people have been terrified not to go in the sun. Plus, they're more sedentary. Not everybody, because some people go to the gym, but they're more sedentary and they're inside. They're not getting sunshine. They're on computers. So we've lost our connection to nature. And so we've gone off the rails in a slightly different way. So now we have more health problems in a different manner. But as they recognize, in these different time frames, 1800s, 1900s, that the majority of your health is in your hands. I would say 99.9% of it. And, what are the keys there? Again, sunshine, nature, eating a good diet. People have different ideas about that, but basically not a processed food diet. Get away from all that stuff. Exercise. And I think actually the number one thing is your mental attitude. Being afraid, being angry, and having all these negative emotions, they wreck your system. They make you not healthy. So you have to tame those things. I get these little notifications on my phone, and they're from various news organizations, CBS News or local news or whatever. It's always car accident, fire, shooting. There's never anything good. It's always something negative. It's always negative stuff. Almost never is there any news about anything positive. It's always death here, or death, destruction here, or war here. Most of this stuff is not affecting you, but they just push it out day in, day out. Most of these things don't affect you personally. And so my attitude is, if you're not going to do anything about it, then just don't listen to it. If you have a topic you're interested in working on, whatever that might be, in my case, it's this kind of stuff, then you do something about it. Otherwise, let it go. Don't obsess about these things. I know a lot of people, oh, did you hear about this disaster and that disaster? And it's like, yeah, but it's not affecting you, and you're not going to do anything, and you worrying about it doesn't fix anything. Turn off the TV, turn off your social media, go live a life. Part of the thing is having social interactions. We're social creatures. So have positive social interactions. If you're having negative ones, get rid of those or fix them. So these are all the things you can do to have a healthy and happy life. So, and then we go back to, whoever's controlling the narrative now, they're controlling the past, and then they get to control the future. So, do your own research. I gave you millions of references. You can check the data, check the quotes, check all this stuff, and dig into it. And you'll find that the history of what you've been told is not real. It's a fantasy. Generally, you don't need a medical system to help you with all these things, unless, of course, it's an accident or something critical. Look for people that will guide you to empower you to do better with your own health, like exercise and de-stressing. And you can use meditation, you can use prayer, you can do lots of things. There's emotion code healing, lots of things you can do. Tackle those things, get your own personal house in order, your family's house in order, and then you're not going to have a lot of problems. I actually accidentally old school vaccinated myself. I was cleaning out gutters, and I had to get under the gutter guard, so I scratched my hand. Wasn't a lancet, but I did scratch my hand up pretty good. I don't know if you could still see the little wounds here. Anyway, and I didn't think about it at the time. I was just like doing a job. And I'm sure I got in bird poop and squirrel poop and decaying leaves and fungus into my bloodstream. And I didn't even think about it. And I didn't wash my hands right away because I was doing other stuff. And then 5 days later, I was shaking and I had a fever. And then my wife noticed, I have these lines going up my hand. She's like, "Oh, you have sepsis." I was like, oh, okay. That doesn't sound too good. So I did a vitamin D hammer and some other things, some other nutrients. And then when she realized she goes, "Oh, that's no problem." I didn't panic. I didn't call 911, which is the emergency system. I wasn't worried at all, actually. And she gave me some homeopathics. I'm like, okay, well, I'll try some of that quackery. And then she gave me some good herbs, a golden seal and echinacea. 12 hours later, I felt fine. 24 hours later, it was all gone. So, use plant medicines and these other things. Don't panic.
I think that is important. It's about staying calm also.
If fear gets you, fear. So there was a Dr. Henry Littlejohn, and I ran across this by accident in 1880. And he worked with the sanitation of the hospitals. And he had a whole crew that did the same thing, sanitariums, I don't know, whatever they called them. And so they would go in there and make sure everything is good. And they were exposed to smallpox, whooping cough, scarlet fever, various fevers, all these different things all the time. And he said in 25 years, he or none of his staff ever got sick, and that none of his family ever got sick. and that the key was don't be afraid. If you get afraid, you become afraid, you will manifest these diseases. His conclusion was that being afraid was a big problem. So don't be afraid. It's a fear of death. And tackling that, your fear of death, because everybody's going to die. We generally don't think about it. And when something happens, we're like, oh, I'm going to die, but you're going to eventually die. So you have to kind of figure out how you're going to tame that. And there's a lot of different ways to do that. And if you tame that, then, these guys can't have any power over you because they can't scare you.
All right. How can I keep up with your work?
Go to dissolvingillusions.com. I have like a Twitter thing I've been using more. There's our email. And we're coming out with a couple new books this week. Finally. Took me a long time. So we got 10th anniversary of Dissolving Illusions. It's a big, thick tome. So it's got 200 more pages on it. And this companion book, which is not as thick, but it's still pretty. It's like 560 pages or something, which has doctors' quotes from those hundreds of doctors, vaccine tragedies, a timeline of events you probably never heard of. So it's a great reference book and that's all fully referenced where all this stuff came from. So it's a good, research tool, and it's filled with fascinating little quotes and stuff. So that's coming out this week. So you can find that on dissolvingillusions.com wherever we get up to updating it.
Roman Bystrianyk, thank you for joining me in the trenches.
Thanks so much for having me. Thank you.
If you enjoyed this podcast, please visit supportjoe.com.